The worn leather bag sat open on the narrow bed, half filled with things that mattered and twice as many that didn't. Ara folded a second wool sweater with careful hands, though her fingers trembled just enough to catch the fabric wrong. She smoothed it flat and tucked it beside the first, then reached for the small wooden box her mother had given her years ago. Outside the frosted window, the sky held that deep blue that came just before true dawn on the last day of the year. Snow had fallen through the night and now lay thick and quiet over the courtyard below, muffling the world into something almost peaceful. She could hear her roommates breathing in the beds behind her, slow, even, still lost in dreams that didn't ache. She envied them that. 3 years she'd been here, living in the shared quarters at the edge of the pack house, where Omegas without family were given space and work and safety. 3 years since the pull had started, faint at first, then stronger, until it lived in her chest like a second heartbeat she couldn't silence. 3 years of hoping he would feel it too. He hadn't. Or if he had, he'd chosen silence. Ara pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed slow through her nose. She would not cry. Not again. Not tonight. She'd made her choice, and it was the right one, the only one that made sense. You couldn't live half a life, tethered to someone who didn't want you back. You couldn't spend your days watching for a glance that never came, a word that was never spoken. The bond wasn't supposed to be one-sided. Every elder, every healer, every mated wolf she'd ever known had said the same thing. When it was real, both felt it. Both knew. So either it wasn't real, or he was choosing to ignore it. Either way, she couldn't stay. She placed the wooden box on top of the sweaters and added the spare pair of boots she'd been saving for. 2 dresses, a cloak her friend Mira had mended last autumn. The travel papers she'd requested a month ago, signed and sealed and dated for the new year. Everything she owned fit into one bag. Everything she was could be carried on her back. It should have felt freeing. It felt like breaking instead. Behind her, one of the younger Omegas stirred and murmured something soft in her sleep, then settled again. Ara glanced over her shoulder at the row of beds, at the faces she'd come to know so well. Mira, with her dark curls spilling across the pillow. Lena, who always smiled first thing in the morning. Evan, who'd taught her to braid reed baskets by the fire on cold nights. She'd miss them. She'd miss the warmth of this place, the way the pack had welcomed her when she'd arrived alone and grieving. They'd given her work in the kitchens, a place at the table, a bed that didn't feel borrowed. She owed them more than a silent departure. But she couldn't explain. Couldn't say his name out loud. Couldn't admit she'd been foolish enough to feel a bond toward someone so far above her he might as well have been the moon. Alpha King Kale ruled this pack and the 3 allied territories beyond it. She'd seen him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. He walked through the halls like a storm made flesh, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair always a little too long, his eyes the pale winter gold of a wolf who'd been born to lead. He spoke low and people listened. He moved and people stepped aside. And every single time she saw him, the bond pulled so hard she had to grip the nearest table just to stay upright. He never looked at her. Not once. Not ever. So she'd stopped hoping. Started planning. Saved enough coin to travel south where her mother's sister lived, where no one knew her, and the bond might finally ease. It had taken months to find the courage, weeks to request the travel papers, days to pack. Now it was done. She pulled the drawstring closed and tied it firm, then slung the bag over her shoulder. It wasn't heavy. That should have been a comfort too. Instead, it just made her chest ache harder, as if the weight of staying had been so much greater than the burden of leaving. She crossed to the door and paused with her hand on the latch, looking back one last time. The room was dim and warm. The fire burned low in the grate. Mira's breathing hitched and she turned toward the wall, still fast asleep. Ara swallowed hard and let herself memorize it. This moment. This place. The last morning she'd wake as part of something bigger than herself. Then she eased the door open, stepped into the cold hallway, and pulled it shut behind her without a sound. The pack house was silent. The feast had run late into the night, celebrating the year's end, and now most of the wolves still slept off the warmth and the wine. She moved quickly through the corridors she knew by heart, keeping her steps light on the stone floor, her breath shallow so it wouldn't fog too thick in the chill. The side door let her out into the courtyard where the snow lay smooth and perfect under the rising light. She stopped at the threshold and pulled her cloak tighter, tucking her chin against the wind. The gate stood across the yard, iron-barred and heavy, but she knew the smaller door beside it would open if she was careful. She'd watched the guards unbolt it every morning for 3 years. No one would stop her. Her papers were legal, her reasons her own. She was free to go. So why did her feet feel so heavy? She forced herself forward, boots crunching through the snow, her breath pluming white in the early cold. The mountains rose dark and jagged to the east, their peaks still holding night. To the south the forest began, thick and shadowed, and beyond it the road that would take her away. She was 10 steps from the gate when she heard her name, low, steady. A voice she knew too well, though she'd never heard it speak to her before. Ara. She froze. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs, and the bond flared so sudden and sharp she gasped out loud. She didn't want to turn. Couldn't bear to. If she looked at him now, she'd lose every bit of courage she'd spent months gathering. But her body didn't listen. Her body had been tuned to him since the first day, and it turned before her mind could catch up. Kale stood in the shadow of the tower stairs, his arms loose at his sides, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He wore no cloak despite the cold, just a dark shirt and trousers, his hair falling across his brow. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been waiting. "Where are you going?" he asked, and his voice carried across the snow-quiet yard like a blade wrapped in silk. Ara's mouth went dry. She couldn't find her voice, couldn't make her lips form the lie she'd rehearsed 100 times. The travel papers felt like lead in her pocket, and the bag on her shoulder suddenly weighed more than the mountains behind him. "I asked you a question," Kale said, softer this time, and he took a step forward. The snow crunched under his boot. The sound was too loud in the stillness, too real, and it broke something loose inside her chest. "South," she managed. Her voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "I'm going south." His eyes narrowed. Not in anger, in something worse. Confusion. Hurt, maybe, though she didn't dare believe that. He took another step, and then another, closing the space between them with the kind of deliberate calm that made her pulse race. "Why?" he asked. She shook her head. She couldn't answer that. Couldn't say the words out loud, not to him, not here, in the cold dawn, with the bond screaming between them so fierce, it made her ribs ache. She turned back toward the gate and tried to keep walking. "Ara, stop." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. And that made it so much worse. Her feet obeyed before her mind caught up. She stopped 3 paces from the small iron door, her hand half raised toward the latch, her whole body trembling now and not from the cold. She heard him move closer, felt the heat of him at her back even though he didn't touch her. The bond pulled so hard she thought it might crack her open. "You can't just leave," he said quietly. "Not without telling me why." She closed her eyes, forced herself to breathe. In, out, in again. Her fingers curled into fists inside her cloak, and she made herself turn around one more time, made herself meet his gaze, even though it hurt to look at him this close. He was barely an arm's length away now, tall enough that she had to tilt her chin up. His pale gold eyes were locked on hers, and there was something in them she'd never seen before, something raw and unguarded, that made her heart stutter. His jaw was tight. His hands hung at his sides, but his fingers twitched, like he wanted to reach for her, and didn't dare. "You've been here 3 years, he said, and his voice had gone rough around the edges. "You've never asked to leave? Never caused trouble? Never—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Why now? Why today?" "Because I can't stay," she said, and the words came out sharper than she meant them to. "I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" She stared at him. He stared back. And for one terrible, wonderful moment, she thought he actually didn't know. Thought maybe the bond had only ever been hers, one-sided and cruel, and he was standing here confused because he'd never felt a thing. But then his expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, guilt, fear. He knew. Of course he knew. Her breath hitched, and she took a step back, her shoulders hitting the iron gate. The cold metal bit through her cloak, but she barely felt it. All she could feel was the bond, alive and blazing between them, and the weight of 3 years, silence pressing down like stone. "You knew," she whispered. "You've known the whole time." Kale didn't deny it, didn't look away. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling too fast, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Yes," he said finally, quietly. "I knew." The world tilted. She'd suspected. Of course she had. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing him admit he'd felt the bond, and chosen to ignore it anyway, that was different. That was worse. "Why?" Her voice broke on the word. She hated that. Hated the way her eyes stung, the way her throat closed up. "If you felt it too, why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me think I was crazy?" He finished, and there was something bitter in his tone. "Mistaken? Because I thought it was kinder that way." She laughed. It came out sharp and jagged, more sob than sound. "Kinder?" "Yes." He moved closer, and this time she couldn't back away. The gate was solid behind her, and he was right there, close enough that she could smell pine and smoke on his skin, close enough that the bond thrummed between them like a living thing. "You don't understand what it means to be close to me, Ara. You don't know what I've—" He stopped, dragged a hand through his hair. "People I care about get hurt. It's happened before, more than once. And I couldn't." His voice dropped. "I couldn't let that happen to you." She stared at him, at the tension in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes, the way his jaw worked like he was biting back words he'd held too long. And for the first time in 3 years, she saw past the Alpha King, past the cold authority and the distance he wore like armor. She saw someone who was afraid. "So you thought ignoring me would keep me safe," she said slowly. "I thought it would give you a choice," he corrected. "If I claimed you, you'd be tied to this, to the politics, the danger, the enemies who would see you as a way to hurt me. I thought if I stayed away, you could have a normal life, a quiet one. You could find someone who—" "I don't want someone else," she cut in, and her voice was steadier now, fierce, despite the tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I never did. I just wanted you to see me. Just once, that's all." His expression cracked. For a moment, he looked like he might reach for her, his hand lifting halfway before he caught himself and let it fall. "I saw you," he said, and the words were low and rough and achingly honest. "Every time you walked into a room, every time you laughed with your friends, or helped in the kitchens, or sat by the fire. I saw you, Ara. I've never stopped seeing you." Her breath caught. The bond pulsed warm and certain between them, no longer one-sided, no longer silent. She could feel him now, really feel him, the way she'd always imagined it would be. His fear, his longing, his desperate, foolish hope that keeping her at a distance would somehow protect her from the weight of what he carried. "Then why are you letting me leave?" she asked, and her voice came out small. Kale went still. His eyes searched hers, and whatever he saw there made something in him shift. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched. He took one last step forward, and this time he did reach for her, his hand lifting to cup her face with a gentleness that stole the air from her lungs. "I'm not," he said quietly. Her heart stumbled. "What? I'm not letting you leave." His thumb brushed her cheek, and his pale eyes held hers, steady and sure and full of something that looked an awful lot like desperate honesty. "Not like this. Not without asking you to stay." He paused, drew a slow breath. "There's a council gathering tonight, the New Year's feast. Stay through that. Let me speak with you after. Properly, please." She should say no, should pull away, walk through that gate, and never look back. That had been the plan. That was still the smart choice. But the bond was singing now, warm and whole and right, and he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "One night," she heard herself say. Relief flooded his face. His hand lingered against her cheek for one more heartbeat, then dropped away. "One night," he agreed. "That's all I'm asking." She planned to run before the new year. The Alpha King stopped her Ara, walked back across the courtyard with her bag still slung over one shoulder, the leather strap digging into her cloak. The snow crunched softly under her boots, and the sky had shifted from deep blue to pale gray, the kind of winter light that made everything feel exposed. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since Kale had touched her face, since he'd asked her to stay. One night. That was all she'd promised. One night, and then they would talk. And maybe then she could finally breathe again. She didn't look back at him. Couldn't. If she turned around and saw him still standing there in the cold, watching her walk away, she wasn't sure what she'd do. Run back to him, maybe. Or run faster toward the gate. Both felt equally terrifying. The side door creaked as she slipped back inside, and the warmth of the pack house wrapped around her like a blanket. She moved quickly through the empty corridors, keeping her steps quiet even though most of the wolves were still asleep. Her room was exactly as she'd left it. Mira's dark curls still spilled across her pillow. Lena still curled on her side, facing the wall. The fire had burned lower, but the embers glowed soft and red in the grate. Ara set her bag down beside her bed and stood there for a long moment, staring at it. All her belongings, all her plans, packed and ready, and going nowhere. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on what tonight brought. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let out a slow breath. Her chest still ached, where the bond hummed warm and steady, no longer pulling her forward, but settling instead, like it had finally found what it was looking for. She could feel him even now, distant but present, a thread of gold running through her ribs that hadn't been there an hour ago. He'd known. The whole time he'd known. And he'd stayed away because he thought it would protect her. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. Maybe neither. All she knew was that the anger she'd carried for 3 years had cracked open and something else was leaking through. Something softer. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. Ara? She jumped and spun around. Mira sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes, her curls wilder than usual. She blinked at Ara, then at the bag on the floor, then back at Ara with a frown that was still half asleep but sharpening fast. "What are you doing?" Mira asked. Her voice was rough with sleep, but her gaze was clear now, focused. "Is that your travel bag?" Ara opened her mouth, closed it. She hadn't planned for this. Hadn't thought anyone would wake before she'd had time to unpack and pretend nothing had happened. But Mira was staring at her with the kind of look that said she wouldn't accept a lie, and Ara was too tired to come up with a good one anyway. "I was leaving," she said quietly. "This morning, I was going to leave." Mira's eyes went wide. She swung her legs out of bed and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, grabbing Ara by the shoulders. "You were what?" "I couldn't stay," Ara said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I thought it didn't matter. I thought I had to go." "And now?" Ara hesitated. The bond pulsed warm in her chest, and she could still feel the ghost of Kale's hand against her cheek, the rough honesty in his voice when he'd asked her to stay. "Now I'm not sure," she admitted. "He asked me to stay. Just for tonight. Just through the feast." Mira's grip tightened. Her dark eyes searched Ara's face, and whatever she saw there made her expression shift from shock to something closer to understanding. "He?" she repeated slowly. "As in?" Ara nodded. She didn't need to say his name. Mira knew. Of course she knew. They'd shared this room for 2 years, and Mira had watched Ara flinch every time Kale walked past, had held her when she cried after seeing him at the autumn gathering, had never once asked why, because she was kind enough not to push. "Oh," Mira breathed. Then again, softer. "Oh." He felt it too, Ara said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. The whole time. He didn't say anything because he thought it would keep me safe." Mira stared at her for a long moment. Then she pulled Ara into a fierce hug, her arms wrapping tight around her shoulders. "That," she said against Ara's hair, "is the most ridiculous and heartbreaking thing I've ever heard." Ara laughed. It came out shaky and a little broken, but it felt good anyway, like something inside her was finally loosening. She hugged Mira back and let herself hold on for a few breaths longer than necessary. When they pulled apart, Mira kept her hands on Ara's shoulders and looked her square in the eye. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Ara said honestly. "He wants to talk after the feast," he said. "He said he wanted to speak with me properly." "Good." Mira's voice was firm. "Then you're staying. And you're going to that feast. And you're going to let him grovel a little before you forgive him for being an idiot." "Mira, I'm serious." Mira squeezed her shoulders once more, then stepped back and crossed her arms. 3 years, Ara. 3 years you've been breaking your heart over him. He doesn't get to just ask nicely and have you melt. Make him work for it." Ara shook her head, but she was smiling now despite everything. "I'm not trying to make him work for anything. I just want to understand." "You will," Mira said, and her voice softened. "But you're also going to show up tonight looking like you're worth fighting for. Which you are. Always have been." She turned toward the wardrobe in the corner and started pulling out dresses, tossing them onto her bed one after another. "Here. This one. Or maybe this. Do you still have those boots Lena gave you?" "Mira, I can't." "You can, and you will." Mira glanced over her shoulder, one dark eyebrow raised. "Unless you'd rather wear the same kitchen dress you've been living in for 3 years?" Ara looked down at herself. The plain wool dress was clean but worn, the hem frayed from too many winters. It was practical, comfortable, invisible. Exactly the kind of thing someone wore when they didn't want to be noticed. But maybe she didn't want to be invisible anymore. The blue one, she said quietly, nodding toward the dress Mira held in her left hand. It was simple, but lovely, the color of a clear winter sky, with long sleeves and a neckline that didn't plunge, but didn't hide either. Mira had worn it to last spring's gathering, and Ara had admired it then, though she'd never said so out loud. Mira grinned. Perfect. Try it on. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Lena woke and immediately joined Mira's campaign to make sure Ara looked her best, braiding her hair into something soft and elegant while Mira hemmed the blue dress so it fit properly. Evan wandered in with bread and cheese from the kitchens and listened to the whole story with wide eyes, then declared Kale a fool, but a lucky one. By the time the sun reached its weak midwinter peak, Ara was dressed and nervous and trying very hard not to think about what the evening would bring. The blue dress fit her like it had been made for her. Her hair fell in a loose braid over one shoulder. Lena had found a silver pin shaped like a crescent moon and tucked it above her ear. She looked like someone worth noticing, someone worth asking to stay. The thought made her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't entirely from fear. Mira squeezed her hand as the afternoon light began to fade. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Better than fine. Just be honest. That's all you can do." Ara nodded. Her throat felt tight and the bond hummed steady in her chest, warm and certain. Somewhere in the pack house, Kale was preparing for the feast too, and she wondered if he felt as nervous as she did, if he was questioning his choice to ask her to stay, if he regretted letting her see the truth. She hoped not. She hoped with everything she had that tonight would be the beginning of something real, something whole, something they could both finally hold on to. One night. That was all she'd promised. But maybe, if she was very lucky, it would be enough. The great hall had been transformed. Ara paused in the doorway and felt her breath catch at the sight of it. Garlands of winter pine and red berries wound along the stone walls, their scent mixing with wood smoke and honey wine. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting warm light that turned the space golden. Long tables stretched the length of the room, already half filled with wolves laughing and talking, their voices rising in a comfortable hum that spoke of celebration and ease. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat the high table where the Alpha and his inner circle would preside over the feast. It was empty still, the chairs waiting, but Ara's eyes went to it anyway. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs, and the bond hummed warm and bright in response, as if it knew exactly where he would sit and was already reaching for him. She forced herself to look away, forced her feet to move forward into the crowded warmth of the hall. Mira caught her elbow and steered her toward the tables reserved for the Omegas and unmated wolves. "Here," she said, guiding Ara into a seat near the center. "You'll have a clear view of everything, and he'll be able to see you too." Ara shot her a look but didn't argue. Mira was right. From here, she could see the high table without straining, and if Kale looked her way, when he looked her way, she wouldn't be hidden in shadow. The thought made her stomach twist. She smoothed her hands over the blue dress and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. Around her, the other Omegas were settling in, filling the benches with easy chatter and stolen sips of wine before the feast officially began. Lena slid into the seat beside her and squeezed her knee under the table. "You look beautiful," Lena whispered. "Stop worrying." "I'm not worrying," Ara lied. "You're gripping that cup like it insulted you." Ara glanced down. Her fingers were wrapped tight around the empty wooden cup in front of her, her knuckles pale. She made herself let go and tucked her hands into her lap instead. "Better?" Lena grinned. "Much." A hush fell over the hall. Ara's pulse jumped before she even turned her head, her body responding to his presence before her mind caught up. She looked toward the entrance, and there he was. Kale walked into the great hall, flanked by two of his advisors, his stride steady and unhurried. He wore black tonight, simple and elegant, the kind of formal attire that made him look every inch the king he was. His dark hair was still a little too long, brushing his collar, and his pale gold eyes swept the room with calm authority. He didn't smile. He never did at these gatherings. But there was something different in his expression tonight, something softer around the edges that Ara couldn't quite name. He moved to the high table, and the hall settled into respectful silence. His advisors took their seats on either side of him, and he remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. His gaze moved across the room, steady and deliberate, taking in the faces of his pack, and then his eyes found hers. The bond flared so bright and sudden that Ara forgot to breathe. For a moment, the crowded hall, the noise, the warmth, all of it fell away. There was only him, looking at her from across the room with an intensity that made her skin flush and her heart stutter. His expression didn't change. He didn't smile. But something in his eyes shifted, softened, and she felt the bond pulse between them like a living thread of gold. He saw her, really saw her, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to wonder if he felt it too. Then he broke the gaze and lifted his hand, and the hall quieted further. His voice carried clear and strong when he spoke, the kind of tone that commanded attention without effort. "Another year ends," he said, "and we gather as we always have to honor it, to remember those we've lost, to celebrate those still with us, to look forward to what comes next." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room once more. "This pack has weathered hard seasons. We've lost friends, fought enemies, endured winters that tested our strength. But we're still here, still standing, still together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Kale let it settle before he continued, his voice dropping just slightly, becoming something more personal. "I've made mistakes as your alpha," he said, and the honesty in his tone made the room go still. "I've kept my distance when I should have reached out. I've let fear guide me when I should have trusted in the bonds that hold us together." His eyes flicked toward Ara again, just for a heartbeat, and her breath hitched. "But tonight we begin again. A new year. A new chance to do better. To choose connection over isolation. To build something stronger than what we had before." He lifted his cup, and every wolf in the hall did the same. Ara's hand moved on instinct, reaching for her own cup even though it was still empty. Mira poured wine into it quickly, her movements efficient and her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "To new beginnings," Kale said, and his voice was steady, but his gaze had come back to Ara, and this time it stayed. "To the courage to claim what matters. To the bonds that make us whole." The hall erupted in voices echoing the toast. Cups lifted and clinked together, and wine was drunk in long, joyful swallows. But Ara barely heard any of it. She couldn't look away from Kale, couldn't break the thread that held them together across the firelit space. He raised his cup toward her, just slightly, a gesture so small that anyone else might have missed it. But she didn't. She couldn't. She lifted her own cup in answer, and felt the bond blaze warm and certain between them. Then he sat, and the feast began in earnest. Platters of roasted meat and winter vegetables appeared, carried by kitchen staff who moved with practiced ease through the crowded hall. Bread still warm from the ovens, honey cakes drizzled with cream, wine that tasted of summer berries despite the snow outside. The pack ate and laughed and celebrated with the kind of easy joy that came from knowing they were safe, together, home. Ara tried to focus on her plate, tried to join in the conversation around her. Mira was recounting a story about last year's feast, something involving Evan and too much wine, and a very unfortunate decision to climb onto the roof. Lena was laughing so hard she nearly choked on her bread. Evan, sitting across from them, was protesting loudly that the story had been greatly exaggerated. But Ara's attention kept drifting back to the high table, to Kale, who sat at its center with the calm authority of someone who'd been born to lead. He spoke occasionally to the wolves beside him, his expression serious, his posture relaxed. But every so often his gaze would shift, sweep the hall, find her, and every time it did, the bond sang. She lost count of how many times it happened. 5, 10, a dozen. Each glance was brief, careful, as if he didn't want to draw attention. But they added up. They built into something she could feel in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the wine, and everything to do with the man who'd asked her to stay. Halfway through the meal, one of Kale's advisors rose and made a speech about the year's victories. Then another stood and offered thanks to the warriors who'd defended their borders. The toasts kept coming, each one met with cheers and raised cups. Ara drank sparingly, just enough to be polite, but her head felt light anyway. Or maybe that was just the bond. Just him, looking at her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. When the meal finally drew to a close and the tables began to clear, Ara felt her pulse kick up again. This was it. The feast was ending. Soon he would come find her, and they would finally talk. Finally say all the things that had been left unspoken for 3 long years. She wasn't sure she was ready. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. But when Kale rose from his seat and his eyes found hers across the hall one more time, steady and sure and full of quiet promise, she knew she didn't have a choice. She'd promised him one night. And the night had only just begun. The tables were being cleared now, plates stacked and cups refilled, and the hall had taken on that easy, contented hum that came after a good meal. Ara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her pulse still racing, despite the calm around her. Mira was talking to Evan about something, their voices light and teasing, but Ara couldn't focus on the words. All her attention was fixed on the high table, on the man who'd risen from his seat and was now speaking quietly to one of his advisors. She watched as Kale nodded at something the older wolf said, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned, and his gaze swept the hall one more time. When it found her, the bond pulled so sharp and sure that she had to press her hand against her chest just to steady herself. He was coming. She could feel it in the way the thread between them tightened, in the way his shoulders shifted as he stepped down from the platform. He moved through the crowd with the kind of quiet confidence that made people step aside without him having to ask, his path clear and direct. Toward her, Mira's elbow dug into her ribs. "Breathe," she whispered. "You look like you're about to faint." "I'm fine," Ara managed, though her voice came out thin. Liar. But Mira's hand found hers under the table and squeezed once, quick and reassuring, before letting go. The wolves around their table had noticed now. Conversations trailed off and heads turned as Kale approached, his pale eyes fixed on Ara with an intensity that made her skin flush. She made herself hold his gaze even though every instinct told her to look away, to hide, to run before this became real and irrevocable. But she'd promised. One night. And she wasn't going to break that promise now. Kale stopped at the edge of the table, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands hung loose at his sides like he didn't quite know what to do with them. For a moment, he just looked at her, and the silence stretched long enough that Ara wondered if he'd changed his mind, if he regretted asking her to stay. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and careful, meant for her alone even though half the table was listening. Will you walk with me? It wasn't a command. It was a question. A request. And the fact that he was asking, here in front of everyone, made something tight in her chest finally loosen. She nodded. Didn't trust her voice. Just rose from the bench and smoothed her hands down the blue dress, suddenly grateful for Mira's insistence that she wear something beautiful tonight. Kale's eyes tracked the movement, then lifted back to her face, and she saw something flicker there. Surprise, maybe, or relief. He offered his hand. Ara stared at it for half a breath, at the calloused palm and the long fingers that had held power and authority for longer than she'd been part of this pack. Then she reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and the bond blazed so bright she had to close her eyes for a moment just to keep from gasping. When she opened them again, Kale was watching her with an expression that was part worry, part wonder. "All right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes." He led her through the hall, and no one stopped them. A few wolves glanced their way, curious or knowing, but most returned to their conversations with the kind of polite discretion that came from understanding when something private was unfolding. Mira caught her eye as they passed and mouthed something that looked like good luck, her grin wide and encouraging. Then they were through the doors and into the corridor beyond, and the noise of the feast faded behind them. The pack house was quieter here, the stone walls holding cold that hadn't quite been chased away by the fires. Kale didn't let go of her hand. He walked with purpose, his strides long but not hurried, and Ara matched his pace as best she could. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the bond hummed steady and sure between them, a thread of warmth that refused to be ignored. They turned down a narrower hall, then through a door she'd never noticed before. It opened onto a small courtyard she hadn't known existed, enclosed on 3 sides by the pack house walls and open to the night sky on the 4th. Torches burned in iron brackets, their flames dancing in the cold breeze. Snow lay thick on the ground, untouched and perfect, and the air smelled of pine and winter and smoke. Kale stopped in the center of the courtyard and finally released her hand. Ara felt the loss of contact like a physical ache, but she forced herself to stand still, to wait, to let him find the words he'd been holding back for 3 years. He turned to face her, and the torchlight caught the sharp lines of his face, the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and choices that had cost him more than she'd realized. "I owe you an explanation," he said, and his voice was rough. "A real one, not the half-truth I gave you this morning." Ara wrapped her arms around herself, more for comfort than warmth. "I'm listening." He dragged a hand through his hair and let out a slow breath that misted white in the cold. "When I first felt the bond, I thought it was a mistake. I thought maybe I was imagining it because I wanted it to be real. But it didn't fade. It just got stronger. Every time you walked past, every time I heard your voice, every time I caught your scent in the halls." He paused, his jaw working. "And I knew if I acknowledged it, if I claimed you, your life would never be the same." "That should have been my choice," Ara said quietly. "I know." His eyes met hers, and there was no defensiveness in them, no excuse, just honesty. "I know that now. But 3 years ago, I'd just lost 2 wolves I cared about. Because someone used them to get to me. They died because I wasn't careful enough. Because I let people see what mattered to me, and my enemies took advantage." His voice dropped. "I couldn't let that happen to you. I couldn't make you a target just because the bond decided we were meant to be together." Ara's throat tightened. She'd imagined 100 reasons why he might have kept his distance, but she'd never thought it was because he was trying to protect her. Never thought he'd cared enough to make that choice, wrong as it was. "So you decided to ignore it," she said, "to pretend I didn't exist." "Not pretend." He took a step closer, and the bond pulled taut between them. "I saw you, Ara. Every single day. I knew when you were happy, when you were sad, when you stayed up too late, helping in the kitchens because you couldn't sleep. I saw all of it, and it killed me not to reach for you." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "But I thought if I kept my distance, you'd be safe. You'd have a chance at a normal life. Maybe you'd find someone else. Someone who could give you what you deserved without putting you in danger." "I didn't want someone else," she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I just wanted you to tell me the truth, to let me decide if the risk was worth it." "And now?" His eyes searched hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen from him before. "Now that you know the truth, what do you want?" The question hung in the cold air between them, weighted with 3 years of silence and longing and fear. Ara looked at him, at the man who tried to protect her by breaking both their hearts, and felt the bond sing warm and whole in her chest. She took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to reach out and touch him if she wanted to. "I want you to stop trying to protect me from my own choices," she said quietly. "I want you to trust that I'm strong enough to decide what risks I'm willing to take." She paused, her heart in her throat. "And I want you to stop pretending you don't feel this." Something in his expression cracked. Relief, hope, fear, all of it tangled together in a way that made him look younger, more uncertain, achingly human despite the authority he carried. "I feel it," he said, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. "I've always felt it." Ara's breath caught. The words hung between them, honest and raw, and for a moment neither of them moved. The torchlight flickered across his face, and she could see everything he'd been hiding for 3 years written there. The longing, the regret, the desperate hope that maybe it wasn't too late. "Then show me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't just tell me. Show me what it means. What we could be if you stopped being afraid." Kale went still. His eyes searched hers like he was looking for permission, for certainty, for some sign that she wouldn't pull away if he finally closed the distance between them. Then his hand lifted, slow and careful, and his palm cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "I'm terrified," he admitted. His thumb brushed her skin, and the touch sent warmth flooding through the bond, so bright and sure that she felt it all the way to her fingertips. "I'm terrified of losing you, of failing to keep you safe, of not being enough." "You already are," Ara whispered. She leaned into his touch, her hand rising to cover his where it rested against her face. "You always have been. I just needed you to let me in." Something in him broke. She felt it through the bond, a wall crumbling, and then he was pulling her closer with his free hand at her waist. Not rough, not demanding, just needed, like he'd been holding himself back for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to reach for something he wanted. Ara went willingly. Her hands found his chest, and she could feel his heart racing under her palms, as fast as her own. The bond thrummed between them, no longer pulling or aching but settling, finding its place, wrapping around them both like it had been waiting for this moment since the beginning. "Ara," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. "I don't know how to do this, how to be what you need and keep you safe at the same time." "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and he closed his eyes. His breath came warm against her lips, and she felt him shaking, just slightly, like the weight of 3 years was finally lifting, and he didn't quite know what to do with the relief. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. "That's not your choice to make." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, her hands still pressed against his chest. "I'm here. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. That's all that matters." He stared at her for a long moment. Then the bells began to ring. The sound rolled across the courtyard from the tower above, deep and resonant, marking the turn of the year. Midnight. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Around them the pack house erupted in distant cheers and laughter, voices raised in celebration. But Ara didn't hear any of it. All she could focus on was Kale, the way his expression shifted from fear to something that looked dangerously close to wonder, the way his hand tightened at her waist, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Happy New Year," she whispered. He smiled. It was small and uncertain and absolutely beautiful. "Happy New Year." And then he kissed her. It was soft at first, careful, like he still wasn't sure she wouldn't pull away. His lips brushed hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache, and the bond flared so bright between them that she gasped against his mouth. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers in the torchlight. "Don't stop," she breathed. So he didn't. The kiss deepened and the world fell away around them. His hand slid from her cheek to tangle in her hair, and she rose on her toes to get closer, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. The bond sang between them, warm and whole and right, and for the first time in 3 years, Ara felt like she could finally breathe. When they finally broke apart, they were both shaking. Kale's forehead rested against hers again, and his hands stayed where they were, holding her close like he couldn't bear to let go. His breath came rough and unsteady, and she could feel his heart racing under her palms. "Come with me," he said quietly. Not a command, a question, an invitation. Ara pulled back, just enough to look at him. His pale eyes were bright in the torchlight, and there was no distance in them now, no walls, just raw honesty and something that looked an awful lot like devotion. "Where?" she asked, though she already knew. "Inside." His voice was low and careful. "To my chambers, where we can talk, where I can—" He paused, swallowed hard. "Where I can ask you properly if you'll stay, if you'll let me claim you, if you'll give me the chance to prove I can be what you need." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. This was it. The moment everything changed. The moment she either walked away or chose to trust him with all the broken, hopeful pieces of herself. She looked at him, at the man who'd spent 3 years trying to protect her by keeping his distance, at the Alpha King who'd just admitted he was terrified, at the person whose bond had been wrapped around her heart since the first day and refused to let go. "Yes," she said. Simple, sure. "Take me inside." Relief flooded his face. He took her hand again, lacing their fingers together with a care that made her throat tighten, and led her back through the door into the warmth of the pack house. The corridors were mostly empty now, the feast having dissolved into smaller celebrations scattered throughout the building. They passed a few wolves on their way through, and Ara felt the curious glances, the knowing looks, but no one stopped them. No one spoke. Kale's chambers were in a part of the pack house she'd never been to before. Quieter, more private. The door was heavy oak, and it closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. Ara stood just inside and took it in. The room was larger than she'd expected, but not ostentatious. A bed against one wall with dark blankets. A desk covered in papers and maps. A fireplace where embers glowed soft and red. Shelves lined with books. A window that looked out over the mountains. Though right now all she could see was her own reflection in the dark glass. It was his space. Private, personal, and he'd invited her into it. Kale moved to the fireplace and added wood to the embers, coaxing them into flame with practiced ease. The light grew warmer and brighter, chasing the shadows into the corners. When he turned back to her, his expression was serious, but open, no longer guarded. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." Ara nodded. Her pulse was racing, but she kept her voice steady. "All right." He crossed the room until he stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. His hands found hers, and his grip was warm and sure and gentle all at once. "Do you want this?" he asked quietly. "Not the bond, not what fate decided for us, but this. Me, the life that comes with being mine. The danger, the scrutiny, all of it." He paused, his jaw tight. "Because if you say yes, I'm claiming you, properly, tonight, and there's no going back from that." Ara's heart stumbled. She looked up at him and saw the fear still there, lurking at the edges. But underneath it was something stronger. Devotion. Certainty. A promise that if she said yes, he would spend the rest of his life proving she'd made the right choice. She thought about the bag she'd packed that morning, about the travel papers in her pocket, about the plan to run south and start over somewhere no one knew her name. Then she thought about the bond that had refused to let her go, about the way he'd looked at her across the feast hall, about the kiss in the courtyard that had felt like coming home. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and sure. "I want this. I want you." His eyes closed for a heartbeat, and when they opened again, they were bright with relief and something deeper, something that looked like wonder. His hands tightened around hers, and he lifted one to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was so tender it made her chest ache. "Then you're mine," he said quietly. "And I'm yours. From this moment forward." The bond flared between them, bright and certain, settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. Ara felt it wrap around her heart, warm and whole, and for the first time in 3 years, the constant pull, the ache, the longing, all of it eased into something that felt like peace. Kale pulled her closer, one hand sliding to her waist, while the other cupped her face with that same careful gentleness. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice," he murmured against her temple. "I swear it." "I know," she whispered back. And she did. She could feel it through the bond now. The depth of his devotion, the strength of his promise. It wasn't just words. It was truth, woven into the very fabric of what connected them. He kissed her again, slow and deep, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear. Just the two of them and the bond that had waited 3 years to finally be acknowledged. His hands were steady as they moved, one sliding into her hair to cradle the back of her head, the other staying firm at her waist, holding her close. Ara's fingers found the front of his shirt and she held on, letting herself sink into the kiss, into him, into the certainty that this was right, that after all the pain and confusion and loneliness, they'd finally found their way to each other. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Kale's forehead rested against hers, and his thumb traced slow circles against her waist, a touch that was grounding and possessive and achingly gentle all at once. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time, his voice rough. "Because once I claim you properly, the whole pack will know. There's no hiding this, no going back." Ara pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I don't want to hide," she said firmly. "I don't want to go back. I want this. I want you. I've always wanted you. Something in his expression softened. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her mouth, each kiss a quiet promise. "Then let me do this right," he murmured. "Let me show you what it means to be mine." He stepped back just far enough to shrug out of his formal jacket, draping it over the chair by the desk. Then he held out his hand to her, palm up, waiting. Ara placed her hand in his and let him guide her toward the bed. Her heart was racing, but it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. Trust. The knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Kale sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her gently to stand between his knees. His hands settled at her hips, his touch warm through the fabric of her dress, and he looked up at her with an expression that was part reverence, part hunger. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "I should have told you that years ago. Should have told you every day." Ara's breath caught. She reached out and ran her fingers through his hair, the dark strands soft against her skin. "You can tell me now," she said. "You can tell me every day from here forward." "I will." His hands slid up her sides, slow and careful, mapping the shape of her through the blue dress. "I promise you that. I promise you everything." She leaned down and kissed him, her hands framing his face, and he responded immediately, pulling her closer until she had to brace her knees against the bed to keep from losing her balance. The bond thrummed between them, steady and sure, and she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own now. The relief, the joy, the bone-deep need to finally hold what he'd been denying himself for so long. "Ara," he murmured against her lips. Her name sounded like a prayer, like a vow. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." His eyes searched hers for a long moment. Then he stood, keeping one hand at her waist to steady her, and reached for the clasp at the back of her dress. His fingers were careful, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, as if nothing else mattered except this moment, this choice, this claiming. The dress loosened and slipped from her shoulders. Ara let it fall, the fabric pooling at her feet, and stood before him in just her thin shift. The firelight turned her skin golden, and she saw the way his breath caught, the way his hands trembled just slightly as they came back to rest at her waist. "You're sure?" he said again, but this time it wasn't quite a question. It was awe, gratitude, disbelief that she was real and here and his. "I'm sure," she whispered. He pulled her close and kissed her again, and this time there was nothing careful about it. His hands moved over her with reverence and need, learning the shape of her, the warmth of her skin, the way she sighed against his mouth when he touched her just right. Ara's fingers found the buttons of his shirt and worked them open, her movements clumsy with urgency, and when she finally pushed the fabric off his shoulders, she pressed her palms against his chest and felt his heart racing under her touch. The bond sang between them, bright and whole, and she knew without words that he felt everything she did. The relief, the rightness, the overwhelming sense that this was what they'd been meant for all along. Kale guided her backward until her knees hit the edge of the bed, and she sank down onto the blankets. He followed, bracing himself above her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. His pale eyes were bright in the firelight, and she could see everything written there. The devotion, the promise, the certainty that he would protect her, cherish her, love her for the rest of their lives. "Mine," he said quietly, and the word was a vow. "Yours," she answered, and meant it with everything she had. He lowered his head and kissed her again, slow and deep, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. The warmth of his skin, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the bond that wrapped around them both and refused to let go. When he finally claimed her properly, with the ancient words that bound an alpha to his mate. The bond flared so bright that Ara gasped. She felt it settle into her chest, into her bones, into every part of her, until there was no separation between where she ended and he began. They were one now, bound, mated, whole. Kale pressed his forehead to hers, and his breath came rough and unsteady. "You're mine," he whispered, "now and always." "And you're mine," she whispered back. The fire burned low in the grate, and outside the window, the stars turned slowly overhead. The pack house had gone quiet, the celebrations winding down, the year turning over into something new. And in the stillness of Kale's chambers, wrapped in his arms with the bond humming warm and certain between them, Ara finally understood what it meant to be home. She let her eyes close and felt him pull her closer, his arms secure around her. The fear that had driven her to pack her bag that morning felt like a distant memory now. All that mattered was this: him. The life they would build together. "Happy New Year," she murmured against his chest. His lips pressed to the top of her head. "Happy New Year," he echoed, "the first of many." And as sleep began to pull her under, warm and safe and claimed, Ara smiled, because she believed him.